When most of us imagine life in the past, we tend to picture energetic blacksmiths hammering away or bustling marketplaces filled with the scent of bread, horses, and questionable hygiene. But today, we're curling up under the thick woolen blanket of something far more subtle, and dare I say, soothing. Life in settlements during long, cruel winters. The days were short, the nights were long, and the porridge, ever present. Let's gently drift back to a time before central heating, before electric kettles, before fleece pajamas with whimsical owls on them. Winters then weren't just chilly inconveniences, they were campaigns of cold, unseasonably long tests of patience, preparation, and wool. Great quantities of wool. Picture a small settlement somewhere in northern Europe, perhaps around the 11th century. Snow has blanketed the thatched rooftops, smoke curls lazily from low chimneys, and inside, families huddle near the hearth. Not so much for bonding, but because the fire is literally the only warm place in a 12-meter radius. That glow was precious. You didn't squander it gossiping about the neighbors unless they were within earshot and also clinging to the hearth. In these months, daily tasks became acts of quiet heroism. Going to the bathroom was a brave expedition, perhaps involving a torch, a bucket, and a very real chance of frostbite should you dawdle. Fetching water meant hacking through a solid inch of ice and then ruining every last drop you spilled on your boot. Even food had winter personalities. Porridge, that noble, beige constant, was the star of the season. It was forgiving, filling, and inexpensive, much like a trustworthy uncle who wears the same wool sweater all winter. Oats were boiled not just in water, but occasionally in faintly flavored broths or lingering regrets from last season's dried turnips. If you were fancy, you might stir in some foraged berries you dried in the summer sun, though by mid-February those hadn't usually been eaten during an ambitious just one more snack incident in early January. Despite the drudgery, winter had its own strange forms of merriment. People told tales, long, winding stories that meandered in the way only old coal stories can. Some were of daring hunts and mythical beasts. Some were speculative epics about what the sky might look like in summer. And some were simply excuses to make fun of nearby villages over their supposed inability to build sturdy sleds. And oh, the clothes. Layers and layers of everything. Wool on linen, linen under leather, and if you were truly cold and well prepared, wool under wool. This wasn't layering for aesthetic, this was survival cosplay. Everyone looked like a walking hay bale with mittens. Sleeping involved tucking into furs, bundling with siblings, and praying your feet didn't stick out from the blanket. You did not want a toe peeking into that frosty abyss. Windows, if a home had the luxury, were stuffed with greased parchment rather than glass. This meant murky views of the outside world and the soft aroma of animal fat whenever daylight dared to enter your home. But it wasn't all bleakness and beef sweet. These long winters built something special, an intimacy with slowness. There was a rhythm to waking, kindling the fire, stirring the same stew, knowing the hands that passed you the spoon were the same that mended your torn mittens. Stories were repeated, not because they were forgotten, but because they were beloved. You learned to live inside the quiet, and the quiet noticed. Outside, beneath frozen earth and beside the silent forests, the world waited too. Trees stood like patient sentinels. Birds vanished. The sky held its breath. Even time seemed to slow, peering in to see how ordinary people bore up under extraordinary cold. So if you're lying there, warm in bed with the murmur of blankets, and perhaps the idea of a faint flickering hearth in your mind's eye, Know this, we've always found ways to endure the cold. Sometimes with strength, sometimes with soup, but always with stories. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, rest easy, gentle traveler. The snow is still falling softly outside the walls. It begins, unsurprisingly, with a draft. Not a war draft, though plenty of those would arrive in due course, but rather the kind of biting, shoulder-nudging cold that seeps through the wood slats of a cottage before the rooster even considers waking up. In the old settlements, the kind of chill we're talking about wasn't just seasonal. It was existential. It wasn't merely winter, it was winter, with a capital W, several expletives, and the quiet realization that your socks were frozen to the floorboards again. By early January, in villages across the northern hemisphere, settlers had entered what might generously be called survival mode, and more accurately described as what fresh miseries await us today. The nights had grown so long that even the stars seemed to be yawning. Daylight made brief guest appearances, barely rising above the horizon, before retiring with all the urgency of a cat you've invited to help with chores. Most days, the sun itself seemed to have better things to do. Let us begin our stroll through the frost with a small Scandinavian hamlet tucked away among thick pine forests. Imagine a snow-covered thatched roof cottage, its chimney coughing little puffs of smoke into the pale dawn. Kindling was life, and firewood was social currency. Forget gold. What you really hoped for as a dowry was a stack of dry birch logs and a man who could split them without crying. Inside these wooden homes, the hearth was king and queen, and quite possibly the only member of government that anyone respected. Children, cats, grandparents, and the occasional sneaky chicken would gather as close as legally allowed to its warm embrace. Meals, if you were lucky, would bubble slowly over a cast iron pot hanging above the flames. Some manner of cabbage stew, which somehow managed to taste both comforting and exactly like every other meal you'd had since late November. Let us tiptoe further west, over the snow-crusted fields toward the early American colonies, where timber-framed houses sat thick with frost and ambitions. In these parts, the early settlers had learned, often through a rigorous and unplanned curriculum, that winter was not merely something to endure, but design your entire life around. Logs were stacked in great teetering piles by the door, and every crack in the wall was stuffed with anything that couldn't fight back: mud, moss, shredded cloth, and on one creatively desperate occasion, a frozen fish. Mornings were not welcomed with joy so much as negotiated with suspicion. You rose from bed not by choice, but because you had reached the final level of sleep, the danger of becoming part of the furniture. The bed, such as it was, likely consisted of a straw mattress, a heavy woolen blanket inherited from someone with much shorter legs, and one sullen pillow that could double as a goat if you squinted. Life moved slowly in winter. Time seemed to lounge in a rocking chair by the fire, sipping boiled water. Contrary to our modern image of bustling activity, much of winter was, quite sensibly, spent doing as little as possible, spinning yarn, mending clothes, and staring at walls. These were not signs of depression, but the cornerstones of a responsible adult existence. Now, don't be fooled into thinking everyone just sat about like sleepy potatoes. There was work, always. Chores did not take snow days. Animals needed feeding, wood needed chopping, and there was always the ominous creak of something about to collapse. Doors warped, roof sagged, and somewhere in the corner, your salt pork wept tiny icicles of regret. The monotony was broken, blessedly occasionally, by storytelling. After supper, families would gather to swap tales, hunched around the fire like suspicious conspirators. Ghost stories were popular, as there was no shortage of creaky noises to blame. Folklore kept children entertained and adults mildly paranoid. Was that the howl of a wolf, or a neighbor trying to trade socks for soup again? Sleep, when it came, was wrapped in deep, muffled silence, the kind of stillness that only comes when the air outside has frozen so thoroughly that even sound decides to stay indoors. The crackle of the fire was a lullaby. The wind whispered lullabies of its own, though in a language mostly consisting of complaints. And so, under sagging beams and heavy quilts, families slipped into hibernation, without quite calling it that. The night outside might be 40 miles long, but inside, time had slowed to a low, contented simmer. Somewhere, a log shifts in the fire, sending a glow across the timber floor. In the corners of those quiet cottages, untold stories begin to stir, the quiet unfolding of how neighbors survived each other when the snow refused to stop. As the pale sun stretched its shy fingers across the frost-dusted horizon, creaking its way above the distant treetops, the quiet stirrings of life began to tick gently into gear. Among early colonial settlements, winter mornings were less rise and shine, and more rise and hope the fire didn't die. Now, before the cozy image of a picturesque log cabin tricks you into thinking winter life was an endless snow globe fantasy, settlers had to contend with realities as stubborn as a mule in a blizzard. If your bed frame didn't rattle with frost and your breath wasn't visible indoors, chances are you either owned 3 fireplaces or were hallucinating from hunger. Most homes were built more for speed than insulation. Settlers fashioned them from hand-hewn logs packed with moss, or, if moss was in short supply, whatever felt vaguely pluggy, clay, straw, or even rags. Windows, if they existed at all, were often covered with oiled paper instead of glass, which did as much to keep in heat as a polite suggestion. The night before, embers would have been banked quietly beneath layers of ash in the hearth, and the first person to stir in the morning had the unenviable task of coaxing them back to life. If successful, there was fire. If not, there was crying, and a shameless sprint across the frost-bitten yard to the neighbor's house, clutching a kettle like a prize pig, begging for a burning coal to borrow. Water, too, had a wicked sense of humor in the winter. Buckets left inside the house would still develop a charming skim of ice, requiring a bit of elbow grease or a prayer before use. Getting fresh water from the creek or well often meant taking turns breaking through an icy crust, all while trying not to fall in and become a soggy, cautionary tale. The first sounds of the day weren't alarm clocks, of course. They were the sputtering groans of logs on the fire, the clank of iron pots, and the resigned sigh of someone tying on their cold breeches. Breakfast, if you were lucky, might mean something warm, corn mush, perhaps some dried venison. If supplies were low and optimism lower, households might lean heavily on bread baked weeks ago, now so tough it doubled as a doorstop and possibly a defensive weapon. Children were expected to help with chores long before the sun turned a respectable color. Even your most sullen 7-year-old knew how to split kindling or groom a reluctant goat, and if they pretended not to, rest assured, winter had a way of persuading them. Motivation strikes differently when your backside is freezing. Sometimes, though, the bleak morning did offer small graces. Steam curling from a mug, as someone's hands warmed themselves like raccoons circling a garbage fire, snowflakes falling in awkward silence, softening even the sharpest silhouettes. And amid all this, even with noses redder than reindeer and fingers like frozen parsnips, there was often a reluctant kind of joy, the quiet triumph of simply keeping things going, one log, one ladle, one long sigh at a time. Still, morale was not guaranteed. Historians have recovered diary entries from winter-bound settlers that range from poetic musings on perseverance to outrage that their pickles froze solid in the cellar and shattered their only surviving crock. And yes, there were pickles, salted cucumbers, slabs of smoked meat, and root vegetables stored in earthen pits like buried treasure. If it could be pickled, dried, salted, or otherwise punished into longevity, it found its way into the winter pantry. This wasn't culinary mood boarding. It was edible strategy. One miscalculated ration could mean eating shoe leather by February and singing sad songs to the turnip that looked like your uncle. Still, community was the secret ingredient to surviving those mornings. Neighbors shared butter, beans, and scandal. Children knocked on doors with hopeful mittened hands, and adults gathered near hearths too small for the stories they told. Fires were borrowed, advice exchanged, gossip seasoned with the kind of wild inaccuracy that only boredom could ferment. And so the day eased into its slow rhythm, paced by the creak of snowbound chores and the occasional thud of someone slipping on the icy stoop. With each hour, the sun inched a little higher, or more accurately said, slightly less embarrassed to show its face. As the smell of salted broth rose from iron cauldrons and boots dried smoky by the fire, new challenges waited beyond the creaky door. Cold nights were long, as you'd expect, but the hours that came just before dusk, that curious time when the light curved sideways and gold splashed across frost, those held ancient magic of their own. In the wintry heart of settlements past, where roofs wore snow like fur hats and chimneys puffed secrets into the sky, there was a hero no colder month could conquer. Soup. Yes, soup. That noble concoction of scraps and sorcery, of boiling bone and whispered hopes. In centuries gone by, winter meals weren't just about calories. They were half-time speeches, morale boosters, edible hugs passed around in wooden bowls. And in the deep snows of December, the pot never left the hearth. Like a loyal dog, it sat by the fire, simmering with a patience unmatched. Let's paint a picture. You, nestled in a timber-framed dwelling in 17th century New England. The wind howls like a church organ with a head cold, whistling through every chink in the wall. The front door has frozen shut, and frankly, nobody's been brave or foolish enough to try prying it open for weeks. The floor, made of uneven planks, creaks complaints with every chilly step. And still, dinner is bubbling. The logic of the perpetual stew, sometimes called a hunter's pot or trencher broth, was simple. Don't clean the pot, just keep adding to it. One day, a rabbit leg. The next, parsnips. Sometimes a bit of last week's duck, and on especially charming days, mystery. The stew tasted like survival, with notes of every worried recipe that came before it. People used to joke that a good stew had memories, though of course, in the dead of winter, no one had the energy to joke particularly loudly. But beyond the stew was the sacred space, the hearth. This was the home's soul, where both meals and gossip were slowly cooked. Children curled near its warmth like dozing river otters, their cheeks dappled with soot and daydreams. Nearby, a grandma would mend thickly darned socks with more thread than original fabric, each stitch a whispered scolding of someone's cold toes. Above the fire, iron pots swung from cranes blackened by years of ambition and spilt broth. The air smelled of onions, pine smoke, and a dash of regret from whoever salted the meat too early last November. Food, back then, wasn't fancy. It was practical, persistent, and proudly lumpy. Grains were soaked for days, dried meat reanimated like culinary mummies, and root vegetables made appearances so frequently they began to feel like extended family. Turnips had more screen time than most children, and while potatoes were busy starring in Europe's culinary revolution, in North America, cornmeal mush was the A-lister. It had many names: hoe cake, Johnny cake, spoon bread, but the subtext remained the same. Don't ask what it is, just be grateful it's warm. Salt pork was another stalwart. A slab of it, nearly fossilized from salting, could last through a winter provided someone remembered where they buried it. It was less of a food and more of a concept. Used sparingly in stews, it added flavor, protein, and an undeniable chewiness that historians now call textural interest. Winter breakfasts were austere compared to dinner. Maybe a spoonful of stewed apples, a nugget of bread soaked in hot milk, or if one was lucky, a hunk of cheese aging nobly in the pantry, if mice, mold, and impatient teenagers hadn't found it first. Coffee. Only if your settlement was absurdly lucky or deeply indebted to a visiting Dutch trader. Most folks settled for hot water, perhaps with a trace of burnt barley or roasted chicory. Caffeine-free, but full of character. Candles would flicker nearby, made from tallow, rendered animal fat, offering both light and an eau de Bayard ambiance. People learned quickly to eat with speed and precision during darker months. The fewer dinners spent picking candle wax out of your broth, the better. And yes, there were misfires. Overcooked mush turned into edible bricks. Frozen bread required a hammer. One bold family in 1659 allegedly attempted to stew boots in desperation. History does not record if they succeeded, but it does bless us with the knowledge that they tried. Despite the hardships, or maybe because of them, food became winter's poetry. Recipes were passed down not just for taste, but for warmth, for togetherness. A family recipe wasn't merely instructions. It was a story of survival with a pinch of seasoning. And as the night sighed through the timbers and families drew their benches closer to the fire, the last soup spoon would scrape gently against the pot, Earth's most ancient lullaby. There, amidst flickering shadows and stomachs softly full, tomorrow waited. Cold, yes, but not hungry. And so, with bellies warmed and spoons resting like swords retired, the settlement drifted toward the next necessity of winter life: sleep. Snowfall had a habit of making everything seem slower, softer, and strangely louder, as if the world had collectively hushed to a whisper, and in doing so, allowed the crunch of each footstep or the creak of each shutter to become monumentally important. In wintertime settlements, particularly those nestled in the more stubbornly cold corners of Europe and North America, that quiet was as constant as the cold itself. And nowhere was that silence more thoughtfully maintained than on the winding walk to, or rather, shuffle to, the communal outhouse. Now, let's not dismiss the humble outhouse. It was a chapel to necessity, a shrine to simplicity, and in the wintertime, it offered the intimate thrill of time travel, back to when plumbing was a bold rumor and seat warmers were a fantasy reserved for the devil himself. Imagine a small wooden structure, half submerged in snow, tilting slightly like it had entertained one too many guests. The wind whispered through the gaps in the boards, reminding you, gently but firmly, that there were not enough layers of wool in the entire province to protect you from what waited inside. Sitting on a slab of icy wood, trousers around your ankles, you began to contemplate the nature of suffering and whether civilization, in fact, was overrated. But even the outhouse had its silver linings, or at least frost-covered linings. For one, it was private. That alone made it better than half of the heated dwellings. And two, it offered brief, meditative solitude, albeit punctuated with frigid breezes and occasional encounters with startled squirrels. Inside the settler cabins, matters were only marginally less brisk. Homes were insulated with whatever materials could be begged or borrowed: clay, moss, cloth, and the vague optimism that this season won't be as bad. These structures were often one room, sometimes two if the builder was particularly daring or stubborn. One if by land, two if by some lucky marriage to a particularly tolerant carpenter. The day began, not with a sunrise, but with the sounds of shivering children arguing about who had kicked whom in their sleep. Families often slept close, sometimes in giant communal beds, more often just in tangled piles resembling a litter of slightly annoyed puppies. Blankets were less like accessories and more like family members. They had names. Historians remain unsure whether pet names like Old Scratchy, Thistleweight, or That Itchy One were affectionate or vindictive. First one up, usually the person suffering either from insomnia or a bladder with deadlines, would brave the cold and coax the fire back to life. Firemaking wasn't romantic. It involved nudging frozen embers with deliberate contempt, jabbing twigs into the tiny hearth, while mumbling whispered curses learned from grandmothers, sailors, or both. Breakfast had to be both hearty and humble. Oats were often the reigning monarch of the table, usually boiled into submission overnight. If you were lucky, there might be molasses or dried apples to stir in. If you were incredibly unfortunate, someone might decide to experiment with salted pickled turnip as a garnish, and you'd silently plot your escape from the table mid-chew. The cold outside wasn't something one conquered. It was something one negotiated with daily. A truce had to be struck between movement and total stillness. Too slow, and your toes would defect from your body. Too fast, and you'd sweat, which was quite possibly the most dangerous thing you could do. A sweaty settler in the snow was a parable about hubris. So chores were conducted at precisely the pace necessary to trick the body into survival. Water had to be hauled in from streams frozen in personality and attitude. Buckets cracked more often than jokes. Ice was chipped, then melted slowly on the stove, then grudgingly used for washing, cooking, and once in a while, a ceremonial splash on the face, followed immediately by howling and protestation. And yet, amid this frigid ballet of routines, something remarkable happened. These communities developed a quiet rhythm. People found strange joy in shared suffering, in the warmth of a hand around a mug, in stories told beside stoves, and in the endless invention of new swear words for frozen door hinges. By the end of a cold day, everyone was a bit smoke-scented and somewhat soot-smeared. Slippers steamed beside fires. Socks hung like sleepy flags of surrender. And somewhere just beyond the window, the snow kept falling, silent, impartial, and ever patient. But tomorrow, there would be something else to focus on. Warmth didn't just come from wool and kindling after all. There was food preservation to think about, a rather chilled game of survival chess tucked inside every soup pot and barrel. And so, as the fire crackled and sleep cooled softly, a new thought gently curled up in a quiet corner of the mind, like a cat who who had finally found the warmest spot on the quilt. Thick snow had settled like a sleepy old cat atop the thatched rooftops, and the village, if we could even call it that, for it was really more of a determined huddle of wooden structures, had gone quiet under winter's firm hand. Winds, shrill as a disapproving aunt, rattled the shutters, while smoke rose lazily from crooked chimneys, curling into the pale sky like dreams whispered from beneath woolen covers. Inside these homes, warmth was not assumed, it was earned. For our resilient ancestors, keeping a fire lit in the depth of February was both a science and a sport. Once lit, the hearth took on a role somewhere between deity and pet. You coddled it, fed it regularly with logs or dung, and in return, it didn't let your fingers fall off. Of course, maintaining such a flame wasn't just about convenience. It was about surviving in a world unacquainted with electric blankets or Netflix. Without reliable insulation, homes relied on heat trapped by low ceilings, thick walls, and enthusiastic layers of animal hides nailed to the walls. It may not have looked like much to modern eyes, but to a medieval peasant, it was home. And with any luck, not actively on fire. That was a bonus. Clothing, too, pulled double duty. Daywear became nightwear. Cloaks doubled as bedding. Wool socks, if one was lucky enough to have them, were sometimes worn for entire seasons without removal, a fact that surely made communal sleeping arrangements memorable. But laced within the scratch and staleness of wool was the quiet dignity of getting through it all, one sleeve at a time. In the north, Norse households endured long, unforgiving nights with stoic tenacity and a rather robust sense of personal boundaries being optional. Whole families would gather on benches around a central fire pit, blanketed in furs, every snore echoing in harmony with the creaking beams. Grandmothers would spin wool while recounting sagas of frost giants and forgotten warriors, even if, by the 15th retelling, some of those warriors began to resemble disapproving cousins or local goats. But it wasn't. All discomfort and cautious optimism. No, winter was also the season when time slowed, when the pursuits of farming paused, and communities turned inward, quite literally. Workshops were moved indoors. Children learned from the elders, most often how to whittle, mend socks, or determine whether their mittens were in fact mittens or defeated garments. And when the wind howled too fiercely and visibility was reduced to the end of one's own nose, neighbors would trade fermented treats, salted fish, or stories too spicy, metaphorically speaking, for summer ears. It was in such moments that winter spun its quiet magic, the kind not bound by snowdrifts or creaky joints, illuminated by beeswax candles or torches made from resin-soaked twigs. Tables became theatres of memory, with bellies full of stew, always stew, seasoned with whatever roots hadn't shriveled, and hands clasping wooden mugs of warm drink. Voices would rise in low harmony, weaving the past with the present in songs built from frost and fond exaggeration. Religious festivals lent structure to the formlessness of the cold season. From Saturnalia to Christmas to the Slavic Maslenitsa, these were necessary joys, carefully scheduled reasons to eat just a little more, drink just a little harder, and laugh just a little louder than usual, not merely as acts of rebellion against winter's grip, but as existential declarations. We are still here. Also, please pass the honey cakes. As nights wore on and snow buried the pathways, even the usual frustrations of cramped living, Uncle Ivar's snoring, or the mysterious disappearance of every dry pair of linen drawers, became tolerable, familiar even. People adapted to the seasonal pause, to the stillness and the reflection it invited. The trick, it seemed, was not merely to endure winter, but to fold oneself into it, like a cat under a blanket, tail twitching in a world gone soft. No grand plans, no rush, just the low thrum of firewood settling, of stories unfurling, of stubborn kindling catching flame again and again. And so, while outside the snow piled up like flour from an over-enthusiastic baker, inside, life found a way. Spoons scraped gently in bowls. Dogs snored under benches. Somewhere, a baby hiccuped, and an old man chuckled as if it were the funniest thing the world had ever produced. That night, as the wind shifted and a silver sliver of moon peeked from behind a cloud, someone stirred the fire, and someone else, half asleep, murmured the beginning of another tale. In the cozy stillness of a winter afternoon, the hearth was more than just a heat source. It was the gossip columnist, the local cafe, and the entire entertainment district spiraled into one crackling, sap-popping corner of the home. It's astonishing how much human civilization owes to fire. Not just progress, warmth, or cooked meat, but hours and hours of intense staring contests with flickering flames, which, back in the 1700s, was basically television with better lighting. Now, picture a colonial settler, or better yet, imagine being one. You, in your many layers of wool, your elbows poking through sleeves patched more times than you can count, trying to coax a flame from kindling in a stone hearth that's as temperamental as a goat in a snowstorm. The room smells faintly of pine smoke and the faintest whiff of last week's stew. You've got frost on the inside of your window, because insulation back then was more of a theory than a practice, and your breath curls in the dim morning air like a ghost that forgot it wasn't Halloween. But still, there's cheer to be had, because once that fire gets going, the entire scope of daily life begins to orbit it. Children squabble for the warmest spots, pressing their socked or occasionally bare feet perilously close to the flames. The stew pot resumes its ever-simmering role as the omnipresent background music of winter households, filled with a mixture of root vegetables, beans, and the occasional mystery morsel no one cares to question too closely after week 5. Firewood was currency in the wintertime. Not officially, of course. Bartering with beaver pelts or 6 dozen turnips was still all the rage. But within the household, the person who chopped it, stacked it, or miraculously located another stash when it seemed to be gone, earned bragging rights that lasted at least a full evening. Chopping wood wasn't just a chore. It was a primitive workout that doubled as a dating resume. A man with a neatly stacked woodpile might as well have been wearing a powdered wig and casually mentioning his 14-acre inheritance. And speaking of social events, let us not forget the noble tradition of communal fires. In some settlements, particularly Scandinavian or New England ones, people would gather in taverns or town halls purely for the warmth. It was an early predecessor to co-working spaces. Minus the Wi-Fi and the cold brew coffee, farmers would bring along wool to spin, boots to mend, stories to wildly exaggerate. It was where you met your neighbors, shared news, and judged someone for not wiping their boots before crossing the threshold. But warmth wasn't just a comfort. It was a strategy. Historically, people were adept at optimizing body heat. Families often shared one bed, not out of affection alone, mind you, but because slumbering in a bundle of limbs and woolen nightcaps was the only way to float into dreams without becoming a human ice sculpture by morning. The idea of personal space was more of a summertime concept. Now, heating methods varied, and with them, efficiency, or the lack thereof. In England, a small metal pot, known as a bed warmer, would be filled with coals and passed between the bedsheets before retiring for the night. It sounds cozy until you remember that it also sounds like a fire hazard. But people made do. They wore nightcaps, stuffed heated stones into socks, and layered their beds with quilts as thick as sandwich loaves. Some even brought small animals, usually not the family goat, but occasionally the family dog, under the covers for added warmth. You might call it unhygienic. They called it practical. Plus, if that dog had a good temperament and the warm fur, who could argue with results? Outside, ice creaked on the riverbanks and snow piled like drifting feathers over rooftops and fence rails. Inside, the fire softly glowed, casting shadows that danced slowly, like they too were settling in for a long winter's night. Bits of conversation floated like sparks. Someone recalling how last winter the stew froze solid inside the pot. Someone else swearing they saw a mysterious light over the fields that was definitely not just old Jonas and his lantern. The hearth was heart and soul and stage. It was where news was shared, wool was spun, and cheeks were warmed. Where the humming silence of togetherness mingled with the snapping of logs and the rustle of a turning page. And as the sky outside turned dark by 5, and the air hung heavy with the taste of coal and hope, the fire continued to burn. Steady, stubborn, almost smug in its superiority over the cold. Soon, even the hearth would dim for the night, and silence would fold across the settlement like a thick woolen cloak. But before the village slips fully into sleep, there are tasks yet to complete, and lanterns to discuss. There were only 2 true certainties in the life of a 17th century settler during winter: that your socks would never fully dry, and that the soup pot would always be mysteriously half empty, no matter how much you squinted into its depths with growing suspicion. As winter tightened its grip on the modest wooden cabins dotting the frontier, or the rough stone homes lining narrow medieval streets farther east, people became experts in the ancient art of waiting. Waiting for food to thaw, waiting for spring, waiting for cows to remember how to produce more milk. It was a season composed almost entirely of patience and layers, so many layers. Let us imagine, with gentle creaking floorboards and a hearth barely flickering, a family huddled under one roof somewhere in Scandinavia. The roof would likely be sod-covered, sprouting snow-laced tufts like a shaggy old sheep napping for the season. Inside, candles flickered with a bravery they had not consented to, and the hearth sizzled when someone tossed on a damp log. Meals, if we could call them that, were often comprised of dried fish so stiff it could double as a snowshoe, or stews made from root vegetables that had been in storage for so long they were practically historical artifacts. But survival wasn't just about food, it was about togetherness. Families would recite stories, share folk songs, or simply sit close enough to prevent each other from becoming ice sculptures. In many cases, the family goat was welcomed indoors, not quite for companionship, but certainly for warmth. Goats, while generally ungrateful and chaotic, do have excellent internal radiators. Further south in the early English settlements, winter life involved another familiar enemy: drafts. Cold, ghostly drafts that slid through wattle and daub walls with more ingenuity than any invited guest. Curtains, often just rough woolen blankets, were hastily nailed over windows. Some folks might even cover doorways with animal hides, both for warmth and because nothing keeps you grounded like brushing past a reindeer on the way to the chamber pot. Now, these chamber pots were a source of contentious morning debates. Who would brave the outdoors or the freezing floorboards for the honors of emptying them? A noble task, if ever there was one, undertaken only by the bravest or the youngest. Historically speaking, it was usually the youngest. For the more well-to-do in 18th century Europe, life during winter might involve a stately drawing room, silver teapots, and enough lace collars to outfit a doily convention. But that didn't mean they were toasty. Heating was largely wishful thinking shaped like a fireplace. Rooms distant from the hearth were cautionary tales, and warm bed was not a given, but rather a strategic victory planned with hot stones and hurried prayers. That's where the bed warmer came in. Picture a small pan with a long handle, filled with embers, slid between the sheets moments before you leapt into bed. It was the 17th century equivalent of preheating your car seat, except with the constant underlying fear of igniting your entire mattress. Cozy? Yes, but potentially flammable. What these cold months lacked in sunlight, they made up for in close-knit humanity, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. Card games, storytelling, and long nights of conversation filled the darkness. In Eastern Europe, folks would gather for vekornici, evening get-togethers that leaned heavily on songs, riddles, and sly courtship, because nothing says romance like passing horseradish vodka while snow pelts the shutters. In Japan's Edo period, families gathered around a kotatsu, a low wooden table draped in heavy cloth with a heat source underneath. The brilliance of the kotatsu was not just in keeping one's toes warm, but in its trap-like ability to prevent anyone from moving once seated. Entire generations may have started and ended their winters beneath it. Yet, despite the numb toes, charcoal-burnt kettles, and mildly grumpy livestock sharing the living space, people endured. Just as seasons promised change, winter's chill shaped rituals, routines, and the rhythm of daily life. Even the seemingly mundane acts, lighting the same iron candle holder night after night, or placing dried herbs around cold rooms for luck and scent, became threads in a broader tapestry of resilience. And now, with ember light fading and the hush of snow-covered rooftops pressing softly against the world, let us watch the quiet hush of one more candle flicker out. All is still, except, of course, for the soft snore of the goat under the bench. In the hush of that hard-earned silence, only one question remains. What happens when all your firewood is under several feet of frozen sheep paths? As the days shrank and the nights grew long and muttering, communities huddled closer together, like a handful of raisins in a particularly determined piece of stale bread. Winter, in the old settlements, wasn't merely a season, it was an event, an annual festival of endurance, creativity, and the occasional unfortunate indoor goat. In the modest log and thatched dwellings of a northern village, somewhere tucked between a biting wind and a terribly unreliable calendar, the hearth became more than just a heat source. It transformed into a gathering point, a storyteller, and occasionally a bread oven/drying rack/catnapping platform. The fire crackled its own soft stories, echoing off the wooden beams that groaned under the pressure of snow and time. The elders would often say that if your boots didn't freeze solid by morning, you probably forgot to take them off before bed. And truly, losing your boot to the frost wasn't the worst of it. There were tales of trousers that froze mid-air on the washing line and stayed there until spring, stiff with dignity. Insulation, you see, was still finding its feet. Walls covered in tapestries or even spare clothing helped keep out the worst of the drafts. Families repurposed everything. Woolen shawls became window curtains. Hay bales doubled as makeshift wall decor, edgy but insulating. and beds were padded with feathers, moss, and optimism. Blankets, they were never in short discussion. Quilts were family marvels passed down for generations, patchworked from memories and questionable color schemes. A good quilt, stitched by candlelight and gossip, could keep a family warm through the fiercest blows of January. It could also cause minor squabbles over which part of one's anatomy was permitted to peek out from beneath it. Evenings, when the snow had decided to no longer fall sideways, were the most bearable. Families wrapped themselves in wool and company, sitting near the fire while someone, typically the person least likely to sing in key, offered up a ballad of bravery, a legend, or a mildly embarrassing tale about their cousin John, who once tried to milk a goat statue in the dark. Children learned needlecraft beside grandmothers who could sew and tuskscape with equal efficiency. The whistles of tea kettles and the scrape of embroidery hoops filled the air. And everywhere, stories of frostbitten explorers, haunted fjords, mysterious lights beyond the trees, and once, quite memorably, a chicken who refused to migrate and was awarded honorary human status. Food took on the warm and bulbous character of necessity. Porridges were the blank canvas of the season, painted with root vegetables, dried berries, and, when lucky, crumbles of cheese or slabs of something salted and mysterious. Stews burbled endlessly in thick pots, only pausing to be eaten or re-thickened with yesterday's leftovers. And bread, bread, was kept warm by proximity to the fire and small arguments over who'd eaten the last slice. Hiccups in supply lines due to storm-blocked paths led to a curious kind of creativity in the winter larder. Left without flour, acorns, no sugar, boiled beets, no meat. Convincing yourself that fermented turnips was surely a delicacy somewhere. Every meal was an invention disguised as tradition. These were months of intimate tedium, of deeply personal frost, of knowing exactly how many knots existed in the roof beam above your bed. The outside world became a muffled whisper. Footpaths disappeared, replaced with tunnels of habit. Routes from the door to the shed, from the coop to the well. Some places even dug snow-covered hallways between cabins, a system not unlike mole real estate development. There were joys too. Candlelight games, early forms of backgammon, shadow puppetry, and the universal favorite, guess what that smell is? There were snowball fights that inevitably turned into snowball truces, and the pure, unadulterated glee of waking to find animal prints crisscrossing the yard, hare tracks, fox steps, and once, a very confused badger's personal interpretation of a square dance. Although biting winds clawed at doors and chimneys whistled like offended teapots, even the harshest winters unfolded in rhythm. Days turned by firelight and laughter, prayers soft as snowflakes, and listening, heart-to-hearth listening, where each creak of the rafters reminded them they were still, in a way, being held. And so, as embers dimmed into midnight and frost grew long on the shutters, the village sank deeper into its winter dream, wrapped in quilts and tales and the blessed warmth of having, miraculously, made it through another cold day. Soon, as the hush of the solstice days gave way to cunning adaptations and odd winter customs, the deepened chill would demand even more curious solutions. As the snow deepened against the timber walls of early Scandinavian settlements, something magical stirred indoors. Not the miraculous kind, no, but the sort woven from practicality, quiet stubbornness, and the intoxicating aroma of boiling swede. Yes, winter mealtime in settlements was less about feasting and more about merging survival with surprising bursts of comfort. And if you were lucky, maybe a pickled herring or two. In regions where the sun slept more than it shone, settlers turned kitchens, or hearth corners to be precise, into the warm hearts of the home. The hearth wasn't merely for flickering shadows and crackling companionship, though those didn't hurt. It was the stove before stoves were a thing, the radiator before central heating, and the slow cooker before Pinterest gave us lentil stew, recipes with smug hashtags. Meat was a precious commodity during the long winters, often hunted or salted well in advance, which meant settlements enjoyed an endless parade of preserved surprises. There's something unshakably charming about a society that considered dried reindeer sinew a delicacy and a practical dental exercise. It was food and floss in one, efficiency at its wintriest. Root vegetables, those loyal, lumpy companions, formed the hearty base of most meals. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and rutabagas that had been tucked in root cellars in the autumn were brought out like celebrity guests. Slightly shriveled, always appreciated. These vegetables were stewed until they lost all memory of their former firmness, yielding to the kind spite of fire and time. Grains, if harvested successfully before the first frost's dramatic entrance, were ground into flour and transformed into dense, solemn loaves that could also be used, if needed, as minor fortifications against wolves. Porridge was the real star, though, a gloopy, clingy affair that clung to spoons with the devotion of a golden retriever. Oats were boiled in water or thin milk, thickened into an edible fog, and, if anyone had been particularly well-behaved, helpful, or in the mood to negotiate, topped with a spoonful of stored berries or a pat of butter saved from the autumn churning. Let us take a cozy pause here to consider dairy. Cows in the winter were not exactly full of generosity, milk-wise. But what's there to do when your bovine companions are moody and the grass is all under a theatrical blanket of snow? You adapt. Sour milk, curds, mouldy cheese. Early settlers were less afraid of expiration dates and more interested in what peculiar flavors time could unlock. Aged dairy became both a necessity and a surprise party for the palate. Tasty, occasionally, inventive, always. Drinks were no less important. In regions with cultural leanings toward warmth and mythology, such as the Norse lands, the fermented apple and honey-based drink known as mead curled in cups like gold. Though not consumed in the quantities we romantically imagine, again, because scarcity is nature's sobering accountant, it added a sweet hum to an otherwise bitter cold. One must not forget the act of sharing meals itself, a kind of domestic ritual cloaked in wool and low-lit chatter. Meals were taken together not just for warmth on the outside, but on the inside too. Children curled like commas beside the hearth, grandmothers stirring stews with spoons long enough to double as ski poles. Even the cat, smug and semi-feral, deigned to hover near the fire just in case a careless scrap danced its way across the floor. Table manners were not the polished napkin-on-lap performances of later eras. Eating in winter settlements was cooperative, practical, and grounding. Small wooden spoons, grooved from years of use, dipped in shared bowls. Bits of bread torn and passed hand to hand. It may have lacked the choreography of royal banquets, but it had the charm of survival shared with quiet dignity. And so, as the wind howled like an unpaid bard and icicles formed like slow-growing stalactites outside the bark-chinked walls, meals triggered a gentle defiance. Every slurp of stew, every crack of dense rye was its own argument against the chill. Laughter, hoarse, smoky, occasional, rose with the steam. Outside, the snow swirled. Inside, bellies warmed, soot kissed the rafters, and someone in the corner began to hum an old tune known only to 3 generations and the dog. Sleep was easier after a hot bowl of something, and the knowledge that, while the world outside could freeze your eyebrows off in a matter of minutes, home still meant warmth, resilience, and perhaps the best tasting beet you've ever eaten. Next, we slip into the layers and textures that wrapped these early settlers, an ensemble of ingenuity, fluff, and quite a lot of fur. The sun, on days when it bothered to rise at all, barely stretched its soggy fingers over the tops of the trees before retreating again in surrender. In the deep chill of winter, the settlement resembled more of a storyline from a Dickens novel than a real place, except colder, and with significantly less organized caroling. Let us wander for a moment into one of the cabins, where life clung with a kind of stubborn warmth. The walls were chinked with moss and mud, a form of rustic insulation that was half practical, half hopeful thinking. If you were lucky enough to possess a window, it was likely greased paper stretched taut, glass being a luxury item, about as common as a summer breeze. Inside, the hearth was the heart and the hero. Firewood, carefully hoarded like ancient scrolls of wisdom, hissed and popped, releasing scents of pine and smoke that clung to every woolen surface. Settlers gathered around it like moths with mortgage payments, their bodies layered in scratchy homespun garments sewn with uneven stitches and parental love. Each morning, or what passed for morning in a world of permanent twilight, began with the ceremonial rekindling of the fire, an event as sacred as it was smoky. It started with flint and desperation. Occasionally, 2 good sparks in a row were enough to make someone weep with joy. Children, wrapped in whatever scrap blankets could be spared, would cheer faintly from beneath their fabric fortresses when the familiar flicker of flame finally appeared. Breakfast in these frigid months. We're looking at a menu equal parts creative and concerning. A congealed porridge, known generously as mulchi, was a frequent headliner. It was made of oats, if available, bark if not, and occasionally dressed up with dried berries or whatever the cellar ghosts had left behind. Preservation of food in winter was more art than science. Root cellars, cool even in summer, turned into little underground treasure chests filled with carrots, turnips, and a general sense of produce-related optimism. Meat, when they had it, was smoked until it resembled something between jerky and old shoe. But it kept, and honestly, after a week, no one much cared about texture. Chores took on a different rhythm. Hauling water from the frozen creek required not just endurance but ingenuity. Ice had to be cracked, buckets filled, and then the whole operation reversed before your eyelids froze together. Clothes washing was reserved for emergencies, like births, deaths, or an invasion by respectable company from another settlement. Outside, the world was hushed. Snow had a way of pressing silence into the earth, muting the crunch of boots and even the sound of your own grumbling. But within it lay a strange kind of beauty. Trees wore snow like old poets wore melancholy, stooped and patient. Animal tracks told winding tales across the white canvas. Deer, rabbit, wolf. Occasionally, human. Occasionally, barefoot human, having lost a boot in a snowdrift and a fraction of their dignity with it. Evenings were quieter still. Light was a precious thing, so families haunched together under quilts and stories. Storytelling, after all, was the original streaming service. Elderly relatives, whose memories were flexible but entertaining, spun tales of their own youth, sometimes during different centuries and under suspiciously unlikely circumstances. One night, they'd wrestle bears. The next, attend secret dances with French nobility. The children listened wide-eyed, warm with wonder and hot cabbage breath. When words ran out, fiddle music filled the gaps. Not always in tune, not always even willingly. Some days the fiddler was just someone related closely enough to be guilted into playing. But the sound, shrill and sweet, cut through the winter gloom like sunlight remembered from July. And when the fire dimmed and embers settled into a drowsy orange heap, there came the sacred layering of the bedding. Quilts piled like sedimentary rock, formations. Sleeping arrangements resembled sardine situations, cozy, somewhat smelly, and economically efficient in the transfer of body heat. Feet tangled. Dreams spiraled outward, carried on the breath of the hearth. All of it, flint sparks, bark porridge, ice fetching, and three-toed bedtime, was stitched into the fabric of survival. Not just of the body, but of the spirit. And so, as snow sampled the rooftops in hesitant flurries, we pull our blanket tighter and listen closely to the sounds just beyond the cabin walls, while the cold gnawed at the edges of wooden door frames and snow pressed like silent guests against the walls of every longhouse and cottage. An odd sort of ritual took place in settlements when winter deepened to its gloomiest. Call it survival, call it seasonal boredom, call it the kind of invention only cold toes and long hours indoors can inspire. It was time for winter laundry. Now, before you scoff, keep in mind that laundering clothes in the dead of winter wasn't just a chore. It was practically an expedition. For early settlers and villagers alike, getting their linens clean in frostbitten months required bravery, planning, and the kind of upper arm strength typically reserved for rowing Viking longships. You see, before washing machines turned the art of laundry into the hum of a distant appliance, people had to exert real effort, often involving snow, fire, and what we will generously call imaginative cleaning strategies. In particularly frigid regions like the northern reaches of Scandinavia or the remote hamlets of New England, villagers often turned laundry into a kind of frozen opera. Water would be hauled in sloshing, back-breaking buckets from whatever partially thawed stream hadn't fully given up on liquid form. If even that failed, snow would be melted indoors with added labor and a lot of patience. Melt enough snow to fill a tub, and congratulations, you have now boiled your weight in ice just to wash 2 woolen socks and a severely suspicious tunic. Soap, incidentally, was either homemade or non-existent. Those capable of crafting their own soap often did so with a mix of lye, animal fat, and a whispered blessing from whatever household spirit was responsible for not burning down the shed. The result was a caustic, miraculous sludge that could strip grime, oils, and maybe your skin, if left on too long. Clothing itself wasn't washed as often as we'd expect today. Woolens, for instance, were humorously reluctant to return to their original shape once soaked, much like cats in the rain. So many people simply brushed garments clean, aired them out, or rubbed them down with snow. Snow cleaning was, in some traditions, considered perfectly legit. You take the article of clothing, lay it over fresh snow, beat it with a stick or flattened branch, and voila. The snow absorbs some of the dirt and oils, and your inner pragmatist feels terribly accomplished. Of course, were you unfortunate enough to have a laundry emergency, and they did have them, especially involving toddlers, goats, or both, you might be forced to wash indoors, turning a humble hearthside into a temporary laundromat. Clothes were cleaned in wooden basins while the house filled with steam, wet wool smells, and the distant dread of drying. Because drying, dear listener, was the real villain in this frosty drama. Without proper drying rack systems, clothing had to be hung near the fire, but not too near, lest the family's only set of long johns became kindling. In some cases, lines were strung high over the hearth, and the family sat below it eating stew, chatting, occasionally dodging droplets from a dripping shirt as if it were a leaky roof, politely asking, "Are you enjoying that turnip?" Some of the more creative households used flat stones warmed in the fireplace to help speed the drying process. Garments were laid atop the stones, flipped, gingerly with sticks or careful hands, and rotated like sleepy loaves of artisan, fashion-forward bread. And as the clothes slowly dried, often for days in the gentlest steam fog of the home, villagers would sit nearby, sewing, mending, or simply staring into the flickering flames, listening to the slow hiss of steaming socks. Even under the grimmest cold, amid snows heavy enough to silence howl and hymn alike, winter laundry had its bright spots. A freshly clean tunic, even if slightly stiff and smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine fat soap, brought a sense of small triumph, a gentle rebellion against the ice, against nature, against yesterday's stains. And so, there in the flickering warmth of a single fire, in a house half filled with clotheslines and cozy with the breath of 100 winters before, another day of stubborn, odd domestic heroism unfolded, one damp mitten at a time. Now, if you gently shift your imagination away from these steaming garments and the curious scent of smoked linen, we'll drift slowly to another corner of winter life, where sounds, not soaps, took center stage. The hearth was the heart of every winter settlement, not just a place for warmth, but the center of stories, meals, and a great many strategies to delay returning to outdoor labor. In the coldest months, people became inventively idle, practicing the delicate art of looking busy while doing very little. And within that crackling warmth of the hearth, entire winters slipped by under bearskin throws and pots of slow simmering root stew. Inside a typical northern cottage, be it Viking longhouse or alpine chalet, daily life settled into a rhythm driven less by time and more by how frozen is the goat today. Morning began with a reluctant rising, often postponed until the fire from last night's embers was coaxed back into life. This was done with the same reverence and patience normally reserved for waking a disgruntled badger, because no one, in the history of January, has ever enjoyed getting out of wool-lined bedding before necessary. Bundled in layers that made everyone resemble slightly antsy haystacks, the family would gather close to the hearthstone, shielding their porridge bowls from passing draughts and offering silent thanks when the oat supply hadn't frozen into a singular brick. Oats, hardy things, were winter heroes. Along with dried peas, turnips, and whatever root vegetables had survived last season's flirtation with frostbite, they made up the main culinary lineup. Culinary luxury, in these frigid months, came in modest forms. A bit of dried meat, cause for a collective hum of excitement. Cheese that hadn't yet grown eyebrows? That was gold. And if someone had a stash of honey, that was practically medieval Beyoncé-level status. Outside, winter's grip was firm and fond of slapping cheeks red. Snow buried paths as if hiding them out of spite. Wind howled like an unpaid bard, but that didn't stop everyone. There was always someone sledding firewood down icy hills with daring optimism, or chasing after skittish livestock who decided, upon reflection, that staying in the pen was optional. In Alpine settlements, livestock often moved inside with the humans during winter. That's not charming, that's logistical. Cow body heat, it turns out, is warmer than philosophical discussions about firewood rations. And while the mingling of beasts and breakfast tables might not pass today's zoning laws, it created a cozy, if odorous form of fellowship. Conversation often had to pause while the goat climbed over the footstool. But winter wasn't all frostbite and hibernation. No, it brought its own variety of stubborn joy. Evening gatherings were common, often stitched together with folk tales and mead. Tales weren't just entertainment, they were survival tools that sharpened the mind and dulled the cold. Spirits gathered around the fire, both the kind you drink and the kind you claim to see in the rafters. In Eastern European villages, people would weave riddles into their fireside chats, prompting not just amusement, but a minor intellectual brawl. What has teeth but cannot eat might provoke fierce debate, especially if food supplies were low enough for someone to consider gnawing on a butter churn. Children, surprisingly resilient, invented snow games that ranged from the exuberant to the mildly catastrophic. Early sleds, nothing more than polished boards or flattened barrels, became tools of both leisure and low-level danger. And icy footprints tracked across every surface became winter's own interior decor. Knitting passed entire afternoons. Needles clicked in rhythm with the fire's pop and hiss. Often, one family member was appointed the unraveller, the one tasked with fixing mistakes made during drowsier rows. Wool, much like families, had its own way of getting tangled. As for hygiene, well, baths were celebrated like holidays. Once a month, perhaps, a great kettle would be hauled over the fire and water would be warmed to a temperature that didn't immediately cause yelps. Communal baths weren't just practical. They were bonding exercises, and no one dared complain about wrinkled fingers when the alternative was trying to break ice from one's hair. All in all, winter settlements moved slowly under snow-laden roofs. Time bent in soft, snowy curves, marked less by clocks and more by stew levels, and how often one's socks could be dried by the fire before they simply gave up. As the shadows grew longer and the wind whispered of storms just beyond the rise, preparations shifted again. A knock of wind against the window shutter, a chilly draft slipping across the stone floor. Signs that tomorrow might demand even cleverer layers and more artful excuses for staying inside just a little longer. Somewhere, in the middle of winter's quiet grip, the glow of human stubbornness flickered softly beneath thick thatch roofs and chimney smoke, curling into pewter-grey skies. Settlers, for all their complaints about frozen chamber pots and boots that never quite dried, met winter's challenge not with panic, but with careful preparation and a hearty dose of communal grumbling. By mid-December, the glamour of the first frost had long worn off. The novelty of breath turning to fog had been replaced with the universal sensation that your toes might shatter like glass if you dared to step outside too long. But indoors, indoors was a different kingdom. There, life was dictated by firelight, slow-cooked stews, and a schedule entirely determined by how long the candles lasted. Let us take a moment to drift into the average winter day of a settler family in the colder regions of colonial America, or equally remote northern villages across early Europe. The key concepts were layering, lingering, and loafing. Layering, because insulation wasn't an option beyond piling on everything you owned. That included linsey-woolsey underclothes, roughly spun stockings, possibly 2 or 3 petticoats or breeches, layered like the world's least aerodynamic onion. Outer garments were, shall we say, rustic. Deer hides, wool cloaks, capes with a dash of mildew, and mittens that permanently smelled faintly of goat. Lingering, because no one wanted to move too far from the hearth. Tasks were carried out as close to the fire as humanly possible. Children learned to do their reading sprawled out like sleepy lizards before the warmest spot on the floor. Even adults became artistic in their ability to churn butter, sew, or twist rope, while practically levitating a toe above the hottest part of the hearthstones. And loafing, a noble winter tradition. When all else froze, the gift of storytelling thawed the human spirit. Neighbors took turns hosting spinning bees, supposedly working sessions for spinning wool, but often just convenient excuses to huddle together and gossip under lamplight. Aunt Mabel's failed pie crust developed mythic proportions as the winter wore on, and someone always delighted in retelling a fiery monologue delivered last market day by a cow, upset over being milked too early. Now, survival wasn't always charmingly homemade. Supplies, and their slow disappearance, were tracked with the solemnity of sacred rites. Barrels of salted pork, root cellars filled with potatoes and squash, jars of preserved berries that were definitely not fermenting yet, and towers of dried beans watched over households like stoic guardians. And God help the man who snuck a handful of walnuts from the winter stash. No punishment was swift, but the Emily Dickinson-level guilt laid on by the matriarch could freeze a man's appetite till spring. Still, it wasn't all gloom and goat mittens. Harsh winters brought out a kind of holy mischief in people. Young ones waxed sleds with tallow and raced down icy roads until someone's trousers split, or a mother screamed from a window, "You'll break your fool neck." And sometimes they did. Not the neck, thankfully, just the sled, which was worse because someone's great-grandfather built it with his bare hands during the year of the 3 snows. In truly frigid times, villagers practiced what was delightfully termed parliamentary sleeping, a communal slumber party in town meeting houses, barns, or even taverns. Everyone tucked in under a smorgasbord of quilts, sharing warmth and snores, occasionally waking to someone's foot in their face or a wandering farm cat seeking superior insulation. For lighting, settlers became oddly philosophical about available options. Candle making was a slow joy, rendering tallow, dipping wicks, sprinkling in the rare drop of beeswax, and then watching them burn down like tiny, majestic hourglasses. Children often pretended the flickering flames housed tiny spirits, who argued when the room was too draughty. Considering how wildly those candles flickered in old houses, the idea caught on. Yes, the nights were long, the mornings brittle, and the chamber pots icy. But winter bore strange gifts too. A closeness forged by necessity, creativity born from limitation, and a kind of sleepy fellowship that whispered, if we can laugh together under 5 layers of wool and a roof threatening to snow inward, we can survive anything. And so, as the wind howled softly like a grandmother shushing naughty toddlers outside their frost-kissed windows, families nestled deeper into their quilts, unaware that their dreams would soon take a wondrous turn toward winter's most charming deception. The mid-season thaw. Snowflakes fell with the deliberation of old monks copying manuscripts, each one perfectly unique, none of them in much of a hurry. The villages of Edring Hollow, nestled along a frostbitten bend in the River Hadlow, regarded snowfall with the same stoic reverence you might reserve for distant in-laws. Beautiful to look at, but best viewed from inside. As the pale dawn crept across the thatched rooftops, the world outside resembled a forgotten cake under too much icing. White frosting as far as the eye could see, but with significantly fewer birthday wishes. Inside the humble homes of our medieval forebears, Life ticked along with the quiet rhythm of survival, tinged with a little whimsy and the occasional cough. The hearth, always the social center of a household, crackled with infinite charm and questionable structural integrity. Much of the day revolved around feeding the fire, an unspoken competition between neighbors to see who could keep their fire pit glowing the longest without actually stepping outside to gather more wood. You might think villagers would tire of discussing wood, but in fact, wood was the season's hottest topic, both literally and conversationally. Birch burned hot and fast, ash burned steady and slow, and alder was considered a bit of a show-off. Everyone had opinions. Old Tom, the village shepherd who hadn't actually seen a sheep since 1377, swore by Hazel. "Burns clean," he'd proclaim while scratching his nose with a coal-blackened finger, like the breath of a polite ghost. Legum, the Old Norse word for just the right amount, described perfectly the winter lifestyle. Too much activity led to freezing limbs. Too little, and you were likely to be mistaken for firewood. People learn moderation not from philosophical manuscripts, but from biting winds. Those brave or unlucky, enough to set foot outside during the short daylight hours, did so wrapped in more layers than a medieval manuscript wrapped for longboat shipping. Wool was the fabric of choice, usually spun thick and soft in earthy tones. Browns, greys, and if you were really lucky, dyed with berries, purple. A good cloak doubled as a gate, a blanket, a baby sling, and when folded creatively, a surprisingly effective argument starter in church. Inside the dim glow of timbered halls and mud-daubed cottages, families huddled together like spoons in a drawer, sharing breath, stories, and meager meals. The air was scented with frost, garlic, stale hay, and hope, though the latter was thin and often misplaced, as evidenced by last winter's belief that singing to the icicles would hasten the thaw. To fill long nights, which in December could last roughly the length of a legal apprenticeship, people turned to storytelling. Not just the grand epics of kings and dragons, mind you, but local tales about haunted goats, teacups that moved on their own, and once, a legendary turnip the size of a baby. Children listened wide-eyed as elders spun yarns thicker than the ones used to knit their itchy socks. And while historical accuracy suffered grievous wounds in every retelling, community thrived. It didn't particularly matter whether the Baron's daughter actually turned into a swan that one time, or whether Finn the miller could truly talk to badgers. What mattered was the warmth of shared imagination in a cold, hushed world. Games helped pass time as well, though limited by materials and imagination alike. Sometimes the games were minimalistic. A popular one, Find the Warm Rock, involved precisely what you think it does. Another favorite, staring at the ceiling beams and counting cobwebs until you either fell asleep or forgot where you started. Entertainment was not as sophisticated, but it was certainly achievable with nothing more than a turnip and a flair for dramatics. Still, beneath the rustic charm and layers of soot, life settled into a predictable, almost meditative cadence. The days wound down early. The animals were locked safely inside barns that smelled of straw and muffled bleating. Shadows grew long and blue across packed snow as the sun bowed out behind the hills. Evening brought the quiet ping of cooling iron, the dreamy creak of roof timbers contracting, and the gentle chatter of families retreating into shared silence, interrupted only by the occasional snore or the poetic mumblings of someone mid-dream. And somewhere, not far from the warm glow of a hearth, a villager sighed, wrapped tighter in wool, already wondering whether there might be just enough ale left for one final cup before sleep reclaimed them. Sleep, after all, was the one domain winter could not freeze, and as night deepened, so too did the stillness, settling softly across the village as another distant tale, half true and wholly comforting, waited to be told. Out beyond the creaking eaves of timber-framed houses and the slow curl of chimney smoke, the world in winter became a hushed cathedral of snow. And yet, life within those frost-bitten walls continued with remarkable stubbornness. You see, when the mercury slipped from smug to sorrowful, it didn't signal a pause in daily life. Far from it. It was simply the season when everything fragrant, warm, and a little bit mouldy came out of storage. Let us now slip quietly into a little home, say, in a Scandinavian village in the mid-17th century. The wind pushes against the thatched roof like a bear leaning on its favorite tree. Inside, oil lamps send golden light flickering over the walls, illuminating a patchwork life of necessity and modest comfort. There's the rough wooden cradle by the hearth, stuffed with sheep's wool for insulation. Nearby, something suspiciously like a turnip, masquerading as a toy, lies half devoured on the floor. Across the table, an old woman knits socks by memory, perhaps half asleep, tracing stitches into a design older than her teeth. Wintertime in settlements was less about thriving and more about, well, not perishing flamboyantly. Food, of course, was the undisputed monarch of the household and was treated with the reverence of a cranky spiritual deity. Barrels lined the walls like chubby sentinels. Dried fish, cabbage floating in vinegary dreams, salted pork pressed under heavy stones, and bread, unimaginably dense, capable of impeding siege weaponry. If you grew tired of chewing on heftier loaves, no matter. Some folks simply softened the bread by dunking it in hot broth, preferably the same pot used since October, which had by now achieved the thick, confident flavor of culinary archaeology. This was a period when food was less about presentation and more about survival, with just enough seasoning to shift the blame from blandness to culinary stoicism. Now, let's speak of clothing, that noble battlement against the freeze. Inhabitants of colder settlements layered garments like onions, attending a formal dinner, wool below, fur above, and often something with a dubious smell somewhere in between. Mittens were sometimes shared communally, not simultaneously, of course, that's just awkward. Woolen socks were prized gifts, flirtatiously romantic even. If someone offered you hand-spun socks in December, it was either a declaration of love or an assurance that they at least wanted you to be warm if you keeled over into a snowdrift. The winter nights were long, not poetically long, but primally, animal hibernation long. Darkness would arrive like an over-enthusiastic guest and refuse to leave until several hours past breakfast the next week. But humans, clever beings that they are, filled these long hours with song, stories, mild gossip, and passive-aggressive embroidery. Storytelling was a favorite pastime, of course. The oral tradition in these settlements thrived during winter, where one could sit near the hearth and hear strangely specific tales of talking goats, ancestral giants, or the time great-grandfather slipped on black ice and coined a family proverb. One resident might begin a story vaguely based on historical events, and 10 minutes later, a fisherman had wrestled a polar bear in a thunderstorm to defend the village's last turnip. And that brings us, naturally, to the outhouse. Oh yes, that cruel rite of winter's passage. Blizzards didn't care about your digestive system, nor did the wind respect privacy. For those without the luxury of indoor facilities, which frankly was the overwhelming majority, heading to the outhouse was a silent exercise in courage and regret. Some brave souls carried a torch, both to see and perhaps to intimidate any lurking wildlife. Others just ran very, very fast, muttering oaths that sounded suspiciously like declarations of independence from bodily functions. Yet amidst it all, there was a sense of community that warmed even the frostiest timbers. Neighbors would share food, tools and stories, and sometimes simply huddle in silence, letting the soft crackle of the fire do all the talking. It didn't matter if you were in a wooden longhouse in Lapland or a cottage on the edge of the Russian taiga. Winter was not survived alone, and as another cold wind sighs against the beams, there is slow laughter brewing from the hearth, the kind too warm to be heard loudly, but felt deeply. Somewhere, wool lies warming over a chair, and a fresh layer of snow quiets the world outside. The night goes on, calm, unhurried. There's another bit of history gently unfolding not far away, tucked beside the fire with a cup of something steaming, waiting to be found. While the wind continued to whisper its chilly lullabies through cracks in log walls and thatched roofs, a quieter drama was taking place within the snug interiors of early winter homes. The artful preservation and cautious consumption of food. Imagine a bowl carved from seasoned alderwood, resting on a table made lopsided by time. It holds not fruit, not fresh bread, not any luxury you might hope for, but a homogeneous, slightly greyish, heavily salted mass that someone, somewhere, once optimistically labelled pottage, a delightful word for something that resembled thick soup, overcooked porridge, or a dare, depending on your optimism. Pottage was more than a dish, it was a lifestyle. A backbone of winter cuisine from medieval Europe deep into the 18th century, pottage was the great culinary equalizer. Poor or rich, everyone met in the middle when it came to reboiling yesterday's stew. It simmered endlessly on the hearth, absorbing whatever was tossed tenderly or absent-mindedly into its depths. A turnip, a strip of dried meat, a suspicious onion that had one last good day in it. All were welcomed into the bubbling, ever-mysterious community that was the winter cauldron. Food preservation strategies in historic winter settlements ranged from inventive to slightly alarming. Smoked meats hung from beams like edible wind chimes, slowly drying under the watchful eye of soot-stained rafters. Cabbages, tough and unbothered by the cold, were buried in pits lined with straw, an underground veggie fortress. Dairy was coaxed into hard, travel-sized versions of itself. Cheese, butter sealed in crocks, and occasionally something called bog butter. Yes, actually buried in peat bogs in Ireland for reasons that remain, shall we say, aromatic. In Russia's icy outposts, fish were frozen solid, then consumed like historical popsicles, chipped into slivers with knives as the need for protein overpowered the need for sensation in one's fingertips. Meanwhile, in Japan's wintry villages, fermented staples like miso and pickled vegetables not only lasted forever in chilly conditions, but also added a lively tang to an otherwise beige meal plan. A spoonful of good pickled daikon could make even the bluntest rice feel exciting. The planning involved in making food last through a long winter was, dare I say, an act of quiet genius. One had to know not just how to grow or gather food, but how to stage its slow reveal across a drama of months when the sun barely cleared the horizon. First came the fresh perishables, apples, carrots, onions, then the root salad stuff, then, maybe by midwinter's sigh, the dried fruits, the salted fish, the beans guarding their flavor like introverts at a wedding. Of course, the wealthier few had access to imported delicacies, sugar, spices, dried figs from warmer lands. But even their grand households leaned on the same preservation techniques. The difference was often in presentation. Spiced swan pie beets root vegetable hash, but both required a good chimney and hours of quiet chewing. Now, the clever reader, or rather clever listener, tucked in beneath a soft blanket, might wonder how anything was kept safe. Without a refrigerator, what stood between a smoked ham and the quiet horror of botulism? The answer lies in the holy triad of historical food safety: salt, smoke, and vinegar. Salted herring didn't just taste like the sea's salty death rattle, it was safety you could chew. Smoke, it turned out, not only delighted the nose, but warded off spoilage, and vinegar. Well, vinegar made nearly anything eternal, or at least immortal enough to get through February. And yet, despite all this careful planning, there would inevitably come a moment in late winter known to many as the hungry gap. That peculiar period when fresh stores were long gone, new crops had yet to appear, and even the pottage pot began to look a bit pessimistic. It was during these weeks that recipes became exceptionally creative, and recipe books mysteriously light on detail. Soak in broth until tender, a phrase that covered a multitude of culinary sins. Still, meals carried on, slowly, stoically, and often accompanied by a strong bark-based tea or an ale that was inexplicably both warm and flat. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was morale. Each mouthful was a bite into survival itself, seasoned with ancestral stubbornness. And somewhere between the third bowl of barley something and a questionable pickle, the earth was already thinking about breaking into spring. Not yet, of course, but soon. First, though, there were games to play, too, within and without. The indoor amusements of winter evenings, when shadows danced across fire-lit walls, and laughter, like preserved cider, took on a warmer hue. The hearth crackled in an uneven rhythm as another snowstorm prowled quietly outside. Wind scratched lazily at the seams of dwellings, those earthen homes, log cabins, and moss-covered roofs, like a cat too polite to really want in. Deep winter had placed its heavy hand on the settlement, and life, as it were, had slowed into a kind of noble sluggishness. Inside, warmth was hoarded like treasure. Not gold, not jewels. Those would be useless now. No warmth was measured in blankets, in stacked firewood, and in the number of bodies huddled close together, preferably fermenting some kind of soup. It wasn't just about survival. It was about making survival slightly more palatable. The cooking fires at the heart of every home had to multitask. They cooked, they heated, they smoked meats, and occasionally, when inspiration struck, they brewed something questionable that was called beer if you didn't look too closely. After all, what is beer but disappointment, pretending to be cheer? Still, it was cheer enough during these long, pale days. Gathered around in furs and cloaks, settlers would engage in a distinguished winter sport, complaining, but with flair. Against the backdrop of hissing logs and bubbling stews, older folks would declare with theatrical misery, "Back in my winters," as if the snow hadn't been satisfactorily cruel since 1674. This ritual grumbling wasn't just tradition, it was communal bonding. It said, "We are cold, therefore we are." Children, impervious to both drafts and doom, bounced within these cramped quarters like breezy little lords of chaos. They invented games with names like "Don't Touch the Frostbite" or "Pass the Onion." which was exactly what it sounded like. An actual onion was passed around until someone dropped it, and everyone lost. Scorekeeping was vague and irrelevant, much like time itself during these extended seasons. Time, in fact, had adopted new conventions. Without enough daylight to mark out a structured day, farmers gave up trying to tell hour from hour. They measured days in stew cycles: morning stew, midday thick stew, and evening extra thick surprise stew. This last was often a communal mixture of leftover beans, regrets, and something that may have once been a fish. No one questioned it. It was warm. Even in the somnolence of winter, there was work to be done, though it moved with the speed of syrup left out in the cold. Mending tools, darning socks, checking traps, penning letters you would never send. These were the slow, deliberate arts of winter. Letters, in particular, were composed with magnificent flourish, describing to distant cousins the hardships of snow, the perseverance of geese, and asking possibly for more socks. And yes, the geese were still there, though they had acquired an attitude during the winter. They refused to fly south, choosing instead to honk with righteous indignation at anyone attempting to walk near their patch of ice. In some settlements, a goose was accidentally elected to local office due to eligibility being defined only by loudness. In the corners of these homes, elderly relatives sat wrapped in shawls, muttering wisdom that swung between profound insight and random observations about squirrels. When bread freezes faster than sins forget, one might say cryptically, causing younger listeners to nod and pretend to understand. Perhaps it was poetic, perhaps it was just cold. Some nights, when the moon spilled over the crusted snow like milk across a tabletop, families would gather for storytelling. Not epic sagas or noble quests, not tonight. No, the crowd wanted tales that mirrored their own glorious mediocrity. The day the door froze shut, when Margot lost her boot for 3 days, and the dramatic retelling of the double potato incident. Evenings bled into nights with a calm that made sleep both a necessity and a luxury. Blankets swelled like subterranean clouds, bodies coiled for warmth, and dreams meandered gently toward spring. And out there, somewhere beneath the piled snow, the seeds of next season's joy lay sleeping, quiet, cold, and absolutely uninspired by the current bleakness. But winds change, as they always do, and in another small cottage nearby, someone stirred from their winter nap, not for soup, nor for stories, but for something even older than both, a little music. It was time, perhaps, to tune the fiddle. In the amber hush of early evening, when daylight hovered shyly just beyond the hills, a quiet miracle unfolded within the cramped corners of medieval winter kitchens. Picture it: a fire crackling with creamy birch logs, the iron pot swinging slightly over the hearth like it was listening to gossip from the rafters, and a draught sneaking playfully past the ill-fitted shutters, only to be chased back out with a firm poke from a wooden ladle. Food, in settlements braving grim winters, became more than survival. It became sorcery. And the cook, a magician in a flax apron. In the frosty months, cooks dealt not with abundance, but alchemy, splitting turnips 6 ways and making them taste like something other than low self-esteem. Root vegetables ruled the pantry, or rather, hollowed logs stacked with knobbly remnants of summer's glory. Cabbages wilted with dignity in the cold. Onions developed deeper meditative flavors, and anything pickled, from beets to bewildered fish, was revered like an ancient manuscript. It wasn't glamorous, but it was clever. Imagine the joy of discovering a shriveled apple tucked away in the loft in January. Practically a fruit-based miracle. households peeled and baked them into tavern pies that didn't look like much, but could startle the taste buds awake like an unexpected goose feather in your boot. Much depended on foresight. In late summer and autumn, women would slice, smoke, salt, jam, jelly, and string every edible that dared cross their path. Even things that looked questionably edible, like a slightly confused-looking mushroom, were given a trial by fire, vinegar, or prayer. Then there was meat, elusive friend and rare guest. In wealthier homes, meaning those that didn't share their walls with livestock, salted hams hung dreamily from the beams, slowly whispering flavor into the air all winter long. In humbler homes, cured meat was a treasure, rationed like ancient scrolls. A fragment in the pot, just a whisper of bacon rind, might transform water into an honest-to-goodness broth, the kind that filled you up more with hope than actual mass. Oh, and broth was everything. The medieval answer to coffee, therapy, and central heating. Neighbors swapped secrets and gossip while leaning over steaming bowls. Ill children were spooned back to life with it. Dentally challenged elders maintained their dignity with it. And the flavor. Well, let's just say, if you've never tasted onion parsnip bone marrow, somehow, also honey soup, you haven't truly lived, nor properly suffered. Baking was another winter miracle, albeit one that required a certain degree of risk. Communal ovens were the norm, particularly in towns and villages where personal bread ovens were rarer than polite chickens. These great stone beasts would be fired up at intervals, and families queued with their loaves like hopeful contestants on an edible talent show. Everyone's dough bore unique signatures: rye, oats, spelt, desperation. There were dramas, of course, accidental bread swaps, allegations of scorched crusts, the occasional bold squirrel that absconded with a cooling bun. But more often than not, the result was hearty fare. Dense, chewy, sometimes a bit judgmental, that kept even the most cynical farmer from slipping into melancholy on an icy Tuesday. And then there was ale. Ah yes, the golden hum of barley joy, brewed in barrels that took half the pantry and most of one's patience. Owls were weak by modern standards, but they were steady companions, providing just enough cheer while sparing the ability to chop wood and not one's own foot. It wasn't all potatoes and stews, though. Special days, or at least days labelled special because everyone felt like they needed an excuse, called for feasts. Pies appeared, steaming and puffed, cloaking mysteries both savoury and sweet. Nuts, saved like jewelled heirlooms, were cracked open and passed around, and honey cakes made rare appearances, likely followed by a spirited debate on whether someone had stolen a second piece. Food bound winter communities in priceless ways. Recipes whispered down generations. Aromas seeped into wooden beams and warmed memory. And as kitchens glowed, as frost painted lace on the windows, hunger met its match. Not in plenty, but in cleverness and a touch of salted pork. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the smells lingered. Cabbage, fire, and stories from long, long ago stirred gently into the pot. Soon, the fire will flicker lower, and we'll find ourselves wandering into dim morning halls and early chores where food was only half the battle. The wind had long since stopped pretending. It wasn't whistling cheerily through the trees or sighing poetically past shutters. No, it was now exercising its full right to rattle bones, whistle through window cracks, and make the most committed firewood chopper start second-guessing all their life choices. And yet, inside the hearty winter settlements, something curiously warm persisted. the tradition of winter games. Now, don't picture a sports arena or anything remotely athletic. No, these were games born of confinement, cabin fever, and sheer creative desperation. When the snow piled above the windowsills and the chamber pots froze before dawn, new entertainment economy emerged. One built on dice, charades, riddles, and occasionally something best described as betting on how long it would take the tallow candle to burn down to the top of the ale mug. In the cottages of the Swedish hinterlands, families played a game called Gissa Gröt Klimpen, guess the lump in the porridge, which was exactly what it sounds like. For reasons unclear to archaeologists or good taste, lucky participants sometimes found a surprise bit of sausage, a dried apple, or the elusive almond, which, according to tradition, meant you'd be married within the year, or at least mildly surprised. Meanwhile, in colonial America, the long, creaky evenings gave rise to storytelling competitions. These weren't formal affairs, mind you. It usually started with someone saying, "Have I told you the one about the haunted turnip field?" and ended 2 hours later with half the room utterly hypnotized and the other half snoring into their cider, cups. Tall tales, ghost stories, and family legends were the Netflix binges of the 1700s, without the buffering. Evening games served another purpose beyond mere amusement. They spun warmth from words, laughter from limits. They united generations because when you're all trapped in the same smoky room, you might as well learn to enjoy each other's nonsense. Grandparents doled out old riddles intended to stump children, especially ones that involved things no longer in existence, like spinning wheels or decently priced wool. One popular challenge across much of Europe was orally building absurd stories, one sentence at a time, circling around the room. Someone would innocently begin. Once upon a time, there was a goose who wanted to learn Latin. And before you knew it, 4 cousins in a row had her sailing to Byzantium with a pig and a questionable map. This, incidentally, is how some of the best family sagas were born. Or at least how one poor uncle got stuck being called Pig Admiral Thorstein for the next 30 winters. These games weren't just fun, they were a seasonal necessity. In places like 18th century Russia or Upper Norway, the winters were not mild inconveniences, but marathon tests of endurance. And mental occupation was critical for survival, right up there with salted fish and a trustworthy roof. There's only so much soup stirring and sock mending one can do before the mind demands a bit of frolic. We also mustn't forget the highly competitive, delightfully passive-aggressive winter pastime of strategic knitting. In villages across Britain and the Low Countries, knitters would subtly one-up one another, with elaborate patterns in their mittens and scarves, each a tapestry of local gossip and bragging rights. If you saw a fellow in February wearing an 8-colour scarf with double cabling and intricate ear-flap embroidery, it wasn't just to stay warm. It was to silently declare to his neighbours, "My aunt has more free time than yours, and she's not afraid to use it." What all of this created was not merely entertainment, but seasonal artistry. A gentle rebellion against the monotony of grey landscapes and eternally wet socks. They were rituals of resistance, hand-stitched and laughter-laced. After all, if you couldn't control the wind, you could still guess which cousin would fall asleep first or win the almond lottery. And so, evenings ticked by. Some homes echoed with guessing games, others with the soft beat of knitted needles marking time. Even the livestock, we imagine, might have leaned in now and then, drawn by the warmth of a good story, or perhaps just the promise of spilled cider. just as the last candle flickered low, and the wind took one final howl past the eaves like a wolf disappointed in its social life. Weary heads tucked into blankets, comforted by the notion that tomorrow evening would bring more games, more tall tales, and if luck held, a new riddle to stump the grandfather. But before sleep gathers fully and the frost creeps once more down the window panes, let's turn next to what brewed in the heart of the settlement kitchens, where winter meals whispered their own kind of magic into the long, quiet nights. By the time December set in, the rhythm of village life had slowed to something between a lullaby and a resigned shuffle. The snow was in no rush to leave, and the sun, that old absentee employer, was working about 2.5 hours a day, give or take. People began to measure time not by hours or days, but in units more relatable. How many layers of wool you wore before accepting your fate as a walking puff pastry. Or how many root vegetables you had left before the stew got weird. Inside the timbered cottages, dimly lit by candles that sputtered like they shared the villagers' general mood, winter had forced a peculiar coziness. Not comfort exactly, since drafts boldly sauntered through cracks in the walls and windows as though they paid rent. No, it was more a kind of shared stubbornness, the warmth of collective survival and passive-aggressive optimism. Around the hearth, families gathered in balls of quilt and wool to wage war against the creeping chill. Grandparents told stories that had very loose relationships with fact. A tale about a fox learning to read. Something about a prize-winning beat. Every bizarre exaggeration was accepted with nods, as if the cold dulled not only fingers, but standards for narrative credibility. Evenings stretched like taffy. Without crops to tend or fields to sow, daylight became more of an atmospheric suggestion than a call to action. So, out came board games, the medieval versions, of course. Dice carved from bone, chess sets with pieces so worn down, pawns and knights had to negotiate their identities before every move. Winter also brought out the village's seasonal philosopher. In many settlements, this was not a formal role, but every winter, someone, usually a man with a beard of increasingly desperate proportions, would begin dispensing wisdom by the fireside, whether invited or not. Cold, he'd mutter, poking the fire with the passion of someone avenging a personal insult. Is nature's way of reminding you that you're not the boss. His audience, draped in layers of linen, half asleep and fully frozen, would murmur polite agreement, which was safer than pointing out that most of his wisdom involved statements that felt deep until you thought about them. Something about time being a spiral, or that snow is really just sky dandruff. In the barn, the animals were even less amused by the season. Pigs grumbled from beneath straw nests that looked suspiciously curated. Cows began refusing to produce milk until someone thought to sing to them, and once they did, the cows developed a taste in lullabies that skewed alarmingly bawdy. Goats simply stared at people with the kind of judgment only goats seem to master, an expression that says, remember this when you're trying to make cheese. Diet, predictably, had become a saga. Root sellers offered turnips in great abundance, far more than anyone wanted, and quickly turning less into a foodstuff and more a philosophical challenge. New stews were concocted daily in brave defiance of culinary ratios. What if, they said, we add another carrot, just to feel alive? And yet, despite the monotony and the cold, small delights glowed like lantern light. The smell of fresh bread, itself a miracle on days when firewood wasn't damp. The simple click of wooden clogs tracing paths across packed snow. the sudden pleasure of finding an onion you'd forgotten about. In winter, onions reached a mythical status. People talked about them the way one might speak of long-lost cousins or treasure maps. "We once had onions," they'd say, with a faraway look. "Real ones, with layers." The pace of days became a kind of meditation. Slower, yes, but also deliberate. With nothing urgent to rush toward, people noticed the little things. The way frost formed feather shapes on the window, the layered music of cracking icicles, the silent vote of confidence when a neighbor showed up with broth and a wink, saying nothing but letting the steam do the talking. There was a strange romance to it all, the resilience and routine, the way humor and hardship wrapped around each other like two cats that pretend not to like each other, but always nap together. And as the fire burned lower, casting long, sleepy shadows on the walls, there was, perhaps, just enough warmth left to carry the weary heart into another night. A wind kicked up outside, shaking the shutters with curious fingers. Somewhere deep in the snow-covered quiet, another tale was beginning to brew. One not of hearths, but of hope clinging to rooftops yet to thaw. Fresh snow piled in muffled silence against the timber-framed homes of the northern village, softening every edge and creaking floorboard. As dawn yawned over the horizon, filtered through a gauze of grey sky and frost-covered glass, something miraculous stirred among the frost-bitten stillness. Laundry day. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could the humble act of laundry, the soaking, scrubbing, wringing and freezing, be remotely miraculous? But in the days of fur-lined tunics and woolen underpants, laundry in winter was nothing short of a heroic saga, especially when temperatures flirted so aggressively with "please don't touch that with a wet finger." In many early European settlements, like those scattered across Scandinavia and northern England, doing the wash in January meant curved spines, cracked knuckles, and an impressive amount of steam rising from boiling cauldrons outside. Locals called it domestic fog. To wash one's gowns, smocks, or particularly tenacious woolen stockings, the process started with hauling giant chunks of icy water from the stream, which had been frozen since sometime just after last September. Women, bundled like walking quilts and wielding wooden paddles like culinary warriors, gathered with their neighbors not so much out of joy, but a shared understanding that if they didn't scrub now, their socks might develop sentience by spring. The washing water was heated over open flames. Lye, made from ashes collected dutifully from winter hearths, acted as a sort of medieval detergent. It didn't smell great. In fact, it smelled vivid. But it had the advantage of dissolving hidden sins from one's undergarments and cutting through the kind of village gossip that stuck to apron hems. Rinsing was a race against ice. Getting your linens doused and wrung before they turned into fabric popsicles was an art. And drying them. Let's just say the clothesline in January was more symbolic than practical. Items often froze mid-drip, strung up as stiff, wind-whipped sculptures. Villagers spoke of drying trousers that maintained their shape overnight, like ghosts practicing high kicks. If you wandered too close in a snowstorm, you risked being thwacked with yesterday's breeches. To solve this, many homes dedicated a modest corner near the hearth, sometimes called the drying nook. Here, socks hung solemnly above the fire, absorbing dampness and occasionally catching a bit too much warmth. Toasted socks were never the goal, but few things said village elegance like scorch marks on your leggings. Despite the difficulties, laundry day was a quiet point of connection. Over vats of steaming water, hands red from cold and raw soap, The day's whispers were exchanged, recipes discussed, small scandals updated. Occasional debates erupted over the best wood to burn beneath the boiler for even heat. Birch was popular, pine was branded too enthusiastic. Even the younger children helped, mostly by being small. Their nimble fingers could weave between garments and ring sleeves more efficiently, all while providing comic relief as they slipped on patches of black ice and landed among the long underwear. And then came the finishing touch, ironing, or in some communities, pressing, which involved heating stones or iron pans by the fire and running them over fabric swaddled in layers of wool to prevent scorching. It was equal parts science and guesswork, and any garments that emerged mostly unburned and mostly dry were deemed a success. A very lopsided, smoke-scented success. By the time the sun had sunk back below the trees, not that it rose too far in midwinter, families folded their now semi-clean clothes into piles, still warm from the hearth. Washed underpinnings were a badge of pride, if only because they confirmed one had survived laundry day without frostbite or socks hardened into weaponry. That evening, the clothes resting in corners, steaming gently and smelling faintly of soap and smoke, the village settled into a subdued satisfaction. Outside, icicles glinted like stalactites made of moonlight. Inside, the hearth crackled, casting flickers across draped linens and already extinguished ambitions to do this all again next week. Somewhere, an old tunic hissed as it dried too close to the flame, its buttons catching the firelight just enough to look smug about it. But tomorrow held no laundry. Tomorrow was something else entirely. Something slower, hungrier, perhaps even, dare we say, a bit mischievous. As the icicles thickened along the rooftops and snow muffled the clang of tools outside, the heart of the winter settlement beat quietly indoors. Inside the modest cabins, communal halls, and flickering hearth-lit corners where stories kept toes warm as much as fire ever could. Now, if you've ever tried keeping a family of 12 entertained in a single-room log house during 6 weeks of grey skies and minus whatever degrees of cold, you'll understand why 18th century settlers developed indoor games, and why some of them were frankly a little odd. Take Button Button Who's Got the Button, not just a parlour diversion, but a full contact sport when you've been snowed in since December. Or the ancient and unstoppable game of Who Can Complain the Quietest, favoured by grandfathers who didn't want to wake the baby while loudly expressing how no one makes mittens like they used to. But even before anyone could complain, these early settlers had to make their settlements winter ready. And that meant preparation that started months before the first frost. Preserving food, gathering fuel, waterproofing boots using rendered animal fat, and constructing windows that didn't so much keep the heat in as they politely asked it not to leave too quickly. Glass was expensive, so panes were small, and oftentimes replaced with waxed paper. That's right, entire villages spent winters squinting through what essentially amounted to slightly better wax paper lunch bags. Privacy was impeccable. Visibility, not so much. Naturally, lighting became a central matter when days shortened and candles were the only way to pretend you could still see. Homes, and especially communal lodges, would become cozy caves of amber shadow and flicker, each candle casting a little optimism against the permafrost reality outside. But sourcing all those candles, well, that was a winter's work in itself. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were cheap, but let's say, scent forward. Beeswax candles were far rarer, reserved for churches, government candlelit drama, and the occasional indulgent family who wanted their log cabin to smell less like stew and more like a respectable apiary. Candle making was usually done by women and children, dipping ever-expanding wicks again and again into molten tallow until layers hardened and a humble landmark of human persistence emerged. Every now and then, a child would dip their wick too short or forget which direction. Gravity works. And so you'd get the special class of candle known as the droplet, shaped like a comma, and only useful if you needed punctuation in the dark. And then, of course, there were storytellers. Every community had a few. The old uncle who insisted raccoons could predict snow by looking east. The neighbour who swore she met a bear who apologised for lapping up their lard. Songs, stories, tall tales, woven between spoonfuls of gruel and the steady scratch of wood being whittled into spoons to stir more gruel. These stories were more than entertainment. They were insulation for the mind, wrapping each listener in layers of familiarity, folklore, and a giggle or two. Children huddled with wide eyes. Grandparents grunted in approval, or competitively dozed off to indicate how many times they'd heard this one before. Winters were lean times. Meals shrank. Coats were patched into oblivion. And teeth, well, let's just say the season of root vegetables and frozen bread wasn't gentle on dental longevity. But despite that, or perhaps because of it, the cold drew people closer. Rooms were cold, but bodies were warm. Laughter rebounded off low ceilings and straw beds. No sensation was taken for granted. Not the heat of a bowl, the glow of a coal, or the first signs of birdsong returning like ancient winged promises of a spring that always came. Even if fashionably late, even churches and meeting houses had their cold season customs. Sermons shortened to the essentials, theology, morality, and a subtle race against frostbite. Congregants packed in close, shuffled awkwardly on shared foot warmers, and sang hymns with a notably higher pitch, half from piety, half from shivering. Outside, the world turned hushed and patient, snow blanketing fields like pages waiting to be written on again. Musicians plucked spare tunes on four-string fiddles, and housecats practiced the ancient art of being slightly in the way of every fireplace in the hemisphere. And slowly, steadily, the days lengthened. Invisible at first, just another shard of sun on a countertop, a brighter dawn noticed in passing. But those in the settlements knew. They always did. Winter, magnificent and maddening, was preparing to loosen its grip. And with it, so were the stories, ready to thaw and wander outward once more. And perhaps come morning, the woodpile would be just large enough, and the silence just soft enough, for something new to begin. Somewhere between the sigh of the hearth and the rustle of wool blankets being tugged just so under chins, the last of the winter days quietly unfolded like a closing book in the candlelight. By now, the villagers moved with the slow elegance of people who have long surrendered to winter's rhythm. It was not an age of hurrying. You didn't run in the snow unless the thatch was on fire, or unless someone spotted the ale cart coming in from the next hamlet over, usually with a single barrel and no apologies. Inside stout timbered cottages, people had all but become furniture. A good chair was worth its weight in silver, and a good spot by the fire was fought over with the passive-aggressive diplomacy of long marriages and hierarchical livestock ownership. The eldest, of course, got the warmest place, unless the dog got there first. The children had ceased to ask, "Is it spring yet?" Instead, they had turned to indoor education, primarily games of pretend that mostly involved witches, snow spirits, and highly dramatized soup-making sessions. Some even took it upon themselves to organize terribly inaccurate plays about local saints, featuring costumes made of onion skins and the odd turnip carved into a bishop's mitre. But the season, though difficult, wore a woolly charm when you stood quietly in it. Out on the edge of the pastures, where snow clung like icing on the low stone walls, there was a silence so pure it made your heartbeat sound like a blacksmith's hammer. Sometimes, on the coldest mornings, the trees wore their frost like old warriors decorated with glittering medals. And for those with a poetic temperament, or simply long days inside with insufficient books, these were moments worthy of quiet reverence, or, at the very least, dramatic sighing. In this closing lull of winter, with stores low but not gone, people grew almost philosophical. "I think," muttered an old beekeeper named Ellen under her shawl one morning, "that winter is nature's way of telling us to sit down and stop cleaning the chicken yard for 5 minutes." Her neighbour, a weaver who hadn't seen his loom in weeks for fear of stiff fingers and misplaced threads, replied thoughtfully, "And I think it's designed specifically to remind us who among us can tolerate parsnips day after day without complaint." Food, by this point in the season, was more creative suggestion than bounteous feast. Pies were now made from things that had no business being in: pies, carrots, aged root vegetables, and stirring amounts of hope. A soup might begin with a noble premise, but somewhere between boiling and eating, it would become a broth of quiet desperation. Yet even that had its charm. Recipes passed down through generations were remembered not for their taste, but for their stories. This stew, someone would say with grave pride, was first made during the late frost of 1316, when the cows unionized and the peasants had no choice but to eat every edible shadow in the garden. And so they cooked, and they stirred, and they waited. The days, though slowly warming, still huddled close to the fire. Sunlight stretched a little further each morning, though it remained bashful behind clouds stitched thick with grey. Signs of life returned in the chirp of birds testing out the acoustics of thawing skies, and in the cautious stretching of limbs that had spent weeks indoors like theatre curtains, reluctant to open before the applause. Candle-making season coincided with this waning chill. The rush to shape tallow into neat little tapers hinted that their dark evenings were numbered. And it must be said, nothing gives such drama to the act of lighting a candle as spending an entire winter without enough of them. People became connoisseurs of flames. "That one," a stern grandmother might remark, peering over knitting spectacles, "burns too fast and smells of goat. It's clearly your uncle's batch." By now, settlements began to resemble creatures not quite waking, but beginning to dream of waking. Tools were cleaned, windows opened, if only for a minute. The indoor voices people had perfected all season, low, slow, and composed mostly of sighs and whispered observations about socks, gave way to deep breaths that night as the embers whispered beneath the ash and snow gently softened into slush outside. The village settled once more, not with the urgency of a storm coming, but with the serenity of having survived one. Huddled under quilts that told as many stories as their mouths ever could, surrounded by the familiar creaks of wood and the earthy perfume of sleeping herbs, they let their eyes close. And maybe, in that long night's quiet, something ancient and gentle stirred, an echo of all the winters that came before, layered like wool between the bones of time. Sleep came not with fanfare, but with a feather's hush, and morning, though not quite spring, waited